The mist clung to the waters like a suffocating blanket, thick and impenetrable. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting no light on the twisted, gnarled trees that lined the swamp's edge. The 14 men, seasoned gladesmen, struggled to keep their boat steady, but the waters were unnervingly still. Their oars sliced through the thick fog, the only sound punctuating the eerie silence. Suddenly, a distant cry echoed through the night, sharp and desperate, but it was quickly swallowed by the mist, leaving only an unsettling stillness in its wake. The men exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had truly heard what they thought they had. Something wasn't right. The further they drifted into the swamp, the heavier the air grew, thick with unease. The fog seemed to grow denser by the minute, wrapping itself around the boats like a cold, suffocating hand. Each man strained his eyes, trying to pierce the veil of mist ahead. The once familiar sounds of the swamp, the croaking of frogs, and the calls of distant birds were conspicuously absent. In their place, a soft, almost imperceptible sound rose from the depths, something like the sloshing of water, or perhaps the murmur of voices just out of reach. One of the men froze, his heart pounding, eyes darting nervously to the side. The sounds were growing louder, closer. Was it just the wind, or was something moving in the water? As the boats continued to drift deeper into the swamp, the sounds began to shift. What had started as a whisper became a chorus of indistinguishable voices, muffled, frantic, and faintly desperate. The men's breath quickened, their eyes wide with the growing sense of panic. Someone shouted, his voice barely rising above the eerie murmurs, but it was drowned out by a sudden sharp scream that echoed across the water, unsettling in its intensity. The man who had screamed fell silent, eyes wide, his gaze locked on something just beyond the fog. What had he seen? The others turned their heads, their bodies rigid with fear. But nothing emerged from the mist, only the unsettling sounds. A cold shiver ran down every spine as one of the boats suddenly lurched, the oars snapping like dry twigs. The man in the boat tried to steady himself, but before he could, his boat began to drift away from the group, carried by an unseen current. The others called out to him, but their voices seemed to vanish in the thick fog. Panic set in as the man's frantic calls faded into the night, replaced by an unnatural silence. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. The remaining men gripped their oars tighter, their knuckles white with terror, but they did not dare stop rowing. The air around them grew thicker, heavier, as though the very swamp were closing in on them. The mist seemed to press in on them from all sides, turning the once familiar swamp into a nightmarish labyrinth. Every sound was amplified in the oppressive silence, the creak of an oar, the splash of a paddle, the sound of a man's breath. But beneath those noises, there was something else, a distant, almost rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat. The men looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint its source, but the mist offered no answers, only the suffocating pressure of their growing fear. The boat ahead of them rocked violently, as if something enormous had just brushed against it beneath the surface. One man screamed as something cold and slick brushed his leg, his foot splashing into the murky water as he pulled it back. There was no time to think. The swamp was alive, and it wanted them. Terror gripped the men as they rowed harder, trying to escape the suffocating fog that seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. The air felt wrong, too thick, too still. They could hear nothing but the rhythmic slap of their oars against the water and the frantic gasps for air that escaped their lips. And yet, beneath it all, there was something more, something watching, something waiting. Every movement in the fog felt like it was being observed. Their paddles hit the water with a force they didn't know they had, but the boats barely seemed to move, as if the swamp itself was fighting them, drawing them deeper into its grasp. With each stroke, the noise from the water grew louder, disturbing unearthly sounds that gnawed at their sanity. And still, the mist closed in. The night had fallen completely now. the fog so thick that it felt like the very air was choking them. The boats moved farther apart as the mist twisted and curled around them like fingers, pulling them deeper into the abyss. The soft whispers of the water, once soothing, now felt oppressive, filled with a sinister energy. One of the men, a tall, weathered figure, was the first to notice something strange. A ripple in the water, far too smooth, too deliberate. It wasn't the current. No, this was something else. Something moving beneath the surface. His heart skipped a beat, but before he could speak, his boat began to veer off course, as if being tugged by an unseen force. A muffled shout pierced the stillness, a cry of alarm from the man ahead. He was suddenly gone, swallowed by the fog, his voice lost to the swamp. The others called out, their voices thin against the dense fog, but it was too late. The boat had vanished into the mist, and no one knew where he had gone. There was no splash, no sign of struggle, only an eerie silence where he had once been. The remaining men froze, their minds racing, their hearts pounding in their chests. The swamp felt alive now, restless, watching them. They knew something was wrong, but the fear of speaking it out loud made them silent. Then came the sounds, the low, gurgling hums that seemed to come from deep within the waters. It was not natural. The noise was foreign, unnatural, as if the swamp itself was breathing. One man swore he saw a shadow flicker beneath the water's surface, dark and formless, but the fog was too thick to make out any details. A sudden, sharp crack of a branch from one of the trees made everyone jump, but when they looked, there was nothing there. The tension in the air was unbearable, and still, no one spoke. The fear of what they had seen and what they had heard hung over them like a dark cloud. As they tried to regroup, the fog shifted again, wrapping itself around them like a shroud. The boats drifted farther apart, and despite their best efforts to stay together, the separation seemed inevitable. Their voices called out to one another, but the mist swallowed them whole. The once familiar, treacherous swamp had transformed into a living nightmare. The air felt thicker, colder, and the darkness pressing in seemed alive, as if it were actively drawing them apart. The men began to panic, their hands shaking as they gripped the paddles. The further they went, the more they felt as though they were sinking into something far darker, more sinister. Then, just as quickly as it began, the noise ceased. But the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed their screams, leaving them in an oppressive void of nothingness. The sound of their breathing seemed impossibly loud now, as if the night itself had turned inwards, trapping them in its depths. And then, one man shouted out in horror as he saw something in the water just beneath the surface, a dark shape, writhing, moving. His scream echoed through the mist, but when the others turned toward him, there was no sign of what he had seen. It was as if the water had devoured it completely. The men continued to row in desperate silence, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. Every ripple in the water, every swaying branch, made their hearts leap into their throats. They could feel eyes on them, watching from the depths, but whenever they tried to look, there was nothing there. The fog thickened, swallowing everything in its path, and the world around them seemed to shrink until it was nothing but darkness and water. No matter how hard they paddled, they couldn't seem to escape the feeling that something was following them. Something was out there waiting. The one who had disappeared was never spoken of again, but his absence weighed heavily on them all. It was as if the swamp itself had claimed him, and in its darkness, he was never to return. The terror of his disappearance gnawed at them. Their eyes darted nervously at every flicker of movement in the mist, and they began to see things where there was nothing. Shadows, stretching and contorting like grotesque shapes in the fog. But when they turned to look, the shapes were gone. The sense of something lurking just out of sight, watching and waiting, pressed down on them like a physical weight. As the night wore on, their fear deepened, coiling around them like the suffocating mist. The deeper they went, the more the swamp seemed to consume them, its darkness pulling them in. The disappearance of their friend had shattered their resolve, and they now rode not out of bravery, but out of terror. Their minds were racing, each man wondering if he would be next. The same eerie feeling that had gripped the one who vanished now clung to them all. A sense that they were being hunted. The water below them seemed alive, its depths beckoning them closer, as if to swallow them whole. And all the while, the shadowy figure that had slipped beneath the surface watched, waiting for its next victim. The boats rocked violently as the mist thickened, swallowing everything in its path. The water churned beneath them, as though something unseen was stirring below the surface. A cold, unnatural current had appeared from nowhere, pulling the men further into the heart of the swamp. Panic set in as the boats began to break apart, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. Desperate shouts rang out as the men tried to cling to whatever floating debris they could find, but the water was relentless, pulling at them like hands from the depths, dragging them further from safety. In the thick fog, they could barely see each other, but the sounds of their struggle echoed in the emptiness. One man, a strong swimmer, shouted over the roaring water, "We need to swim for shore." The others nodded, terror in their eyes, but there was no time for hesitation. The water felt alive, moving beneath them with malevolent intent. As the men dove into the swamp's murky depths, the sensation of something lurking just beneath the surface intensified. Shadows seemed to follow them, rising and falling with the current, brushing against their legs like hands pulling at their skin. Their movements became frantic as the dark figures in the water closed in, but no one dared to look down, too afraid to see what was following them. As they fought the current, the darkness seemed to grow, closing in on them from all sides. Every stroke they took only seemed to pull them deeper into the unknown. The murky water, thick with the scent of decay, churned violently around them. One man cried out, his voice cracking in fear as something cold and slick brushed his leg, pulling him under for a moment. He surfaced, gasping, but the water felt heavier, like invisible hands were clutching his limbs, dragging him back down. The fog swirled, and through the dense mist, he thought he saw figures in the distance. Some of the men still afloat, some already submerged, their faces contorted in terror. A distant, blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness, echoing through the swamp. One by one, the men began to disappear. First, it was the man to the left, his silhouette vanishing into the darkness, as if the water had swallowed him whole. Then another, and another, their screams fading into the oppressive silence of the swamp. Only 8 men remained visible, struggling against the relentless current. But even they were losing their grip on hope. Every stroke felt like it took them further from the shore, their bodies weary and their minds unraveling. The fog seemed to press in, thickening until they could no longer see the shore or the others. They were isolated in the vast nothingness. The current seemed to have a mind of its own, pulling them deeper into the abyss. One man, barely able to keep his head above the water, felt something slippery wrap around his leg, tugging him beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat as panic surged through him, but when he kicked his leg free, there was nothing there. He didn't dare look again, his heart pounding in his chest. The others were barely in sight, but the fear in their eyes was enough to confirm that they too could feel the presence of something lurking just below the surface. The water wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, alive with a presence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The men tried to call out to each other, but the fog swallowed their voices, turning them into faint whispers that were quickly lost in the howling wind. The darkness around them deepened, and every movement in the water felt like an unseen force pulling at their legs, tugging them back into the depths. Another scream echoed from somewhere in the distance, but it was cut short. The air grew thick with fear as the remaining men paddled and swam, their bodies growing heavier with each passing second. The shadows in the water seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward them, threatening to drag them into the inky blackness below. Each breath felt like a battle, the air thick with a musty, stagnant smell that made them gag. The fog pressed in, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, just when they thought they might be safe, something moved in the water beneath them. A shadow surged forward with unnatural speed, a dark figure that shot past them so quickly that it left ripples in its wake. A desperate gasp escaped one of the men as he felt something icy brush his foot, then his leg, as if it were pulling him toward the depths. He kicked wildly, but the sensation wouldn't leave him. He was being followed, and the others. They were disappearing one by one, leaving him alone with whatever hunted them. Suddenly, the water around them began to quiet. The violent tugging, the pull of the current, ceased. But the silence that followed was far worse. The absence of movement felt like a waiting room for something far worse. As they swam desperately toward the shore, every man's mind raced with the thought, who would be next? The silence was thick now, smothering. Another man disappeared into the fog, his body never to be seen again. The remaining survivors could only swim faster, the shadowy figures in the water still lurking just beneath the surface. The terror in their eyes was palpable, but it was too late. The swamp had already claimed its first victims, and it wasn't done yet. The three survivors stumbled onto the shore, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. The fog clung to their clothes like damp cobwebs, and the swamp's oppressive silence pressed down on them. They had made it to land, but something felt horribly wrong. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and as they glanced around, their eyes fell on something unexpected, an abandoned camp. Tattered remnants of a once vibrant fire pit sat cold and unlit, surrounded by broken, half-buried belongings. The smell of damp wood and decay filled their noses, and they realized there had been a struggle here recently, but who had been left behind? As they cautiously approached the camp, the men's breaths quickened. The remnants of the campfire lay scattered, the logs long since burnt out. There were strange marks on the ground, deep impressions that looked almost like large, dragging footprints. But the air was still, and there was no sign of a recent storm or disturbance. One of the men pointed toward the trees at the far edge of the camp, where the earth had been disturbed, as though something had been dragged across it. His voice trembled as he spoke. Something happened here. Something bad. The other two men nodded, their faces pale with realization. The silence around them was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustling of the trees. The trees surrounding the camp swayed unnaturally, their branches creaking and bending as if moved by a wind that didn't exist. The air remained unnervingly still, the humid, heavy atmosphere pressing on their chests. Each of the men instinctively looked around, but there was no breeze, no gust, just the eerie motion of the branches above them. The ground felt soft beneath their feet, but the air was stagnant, as though everything had been frozen in place. They huddled together, their senses screaming that they were not alone. A sudden distant crack of a branch made them jump, but the source of the noise remained hidden in the dense fog. One of the survivors moved closer to the fire pit, inspecting the ground for any clues. As his fingers traced the cool, ashen remnants of the fire, he found something horrifying, something that didn't belong. Blood, fresh and sticky, splattered across the stones, still glistening in the dark. His stomach churned and he recoiled, his hands shaking as he pointed to the bloodstains. "This is recent," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "This isn't from the past." The other two men looked at each other in disbelief, their fear growing with every passing second. Whoever had been here recently hadn't left voluntarily. They'd been taken, or worse. The sense of being watched grew unbearable as they examined the camp. The footprints around the area, some faded and others deep, suggested frantic movement, but no bodies. The camp was a ghost, abandoned in a hurry but seemingly recently used. The feeling of being hunted grew sharper, as if the swamp itself had been waiting for them, preparing to claim them just as it had claimed the others. There was no sound from the trees, no distant animal calls, only the heavy, suffocating silence. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as their eyes darted nervously through the mist. Something was lurking, something they couldn't see, but it was there, and it was drawing closer. They turned their attention to a small tent, its fabric torn and frayed at the edges, as if something large had torn through it with terrifying strength. The metal stakes had been uprooted violently, and the earth around it was disturbed, as though there had been a struggle here too. One of the men approached cautiously, his hands trembling, and when he reached out to touch the remnants of the tent, a sudden noise made him freeze, a low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable. His blood ran cold, and he turned to the others, his eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" he gasped. The growl grew louder, closer, and the feeling of being surrounded intensified, as though the swamp itself was closing in around them. Panic set in as the growling seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the dense fog. The three men clung to each other, their eyes darting around, searching for the source of the sound. The trees moved once again, but this time they could see the dark shapes swaying through the mist. Shadows, impossibly tall, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. One of the survivors stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he backed into the campfire pit. The flickering embers casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Something was moving toward them, and they weren't alone. The feeling of dread was suffocating, like a predator slowly circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. With nowhere to run and no escape, the men realized that the swamp had no intention of letting them go. They could hear the growling now, coming closer, and the shadows in the trees were no longer subtle. They were approaching with an almost predatory certainty. The camp, once a place of temporary safety, had become a trap. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the fog thickening and swirling with each passing second. The men's frantic breaths were the only sound in the air as the realization sank in. Whatever had been left behind in the swamp was still there, and it was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The three men cautiously explored the abandoned camp, each step amplifying the sense of unease that gripped their hearts. As they moved deeper into the shadows, their eyes flicked nervously from one dark corner to the next. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the fog itself were alive, pressing down on them. Then, in the distance, they saw it, an unmistakable gleam in the darkness. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection, but as they focused, the glow became clearer. Eyes, faintly glowing, staring at them from beyond the trees. The men froze. The eyes blinked once, then disappeared, swallowed by the mist. The silence that followed was deafening, yet the feeling that something watched them grew stronger with each passing second. Shivers ran down their spines as they cautiously stepped forward, their breaths shallow and quick. The air around them seemed to pulse, vibrating with something unseen, something ancient. The silence was shattered by a distant, haunting laugh, a low chuckle that echoed through the fog, too close, too real. The men looked around, panic rising in their chests, but there was no sign of anyone else. The camp, with its blood-stained earth and remnants of a violent past, now felt like a place of hidden horrors, where the very air was thick with the spirits of the dead. They exchanged nervous glances, all of them wondering if they were losing their minds, or if something truly lingered here. As they ventured further, the figures began to materialize. Pale, wispy forms appeared just on the edge of their vision. First one, then another. The men could hear their footsteps now, faint echoes in the mist. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Then, one of the apparitions became clear. A man, barely visible, standing just beyond the trees, his face obscured by a dark hood, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. His mouth moved, but no sound came from him. The survivor's heart pounded as he backed away, his legs feeling weak. "We're not alone," he whispered, but the words seemed to vanish into the fog, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The air grew colder as more apparitions appeared, not as recognizable faces, but as forms twisted in the fog, blurry yet defined by their unnatural presence. Some stood motionless, their eyes locked onto the survivors, while others drifted aimlessly, their limbs hanging like ragged cloth. None of them were the other gladesmen, but their presence was no less terrifying. The men could hear the murmur of voices now, faint whispers carried by the wind, or perhaps they were in their minds. The voices seemed to speak in a language they couldn't understand, yet the fear in their tone was unmistakable. The laughter returned, closer this time, followed by another chilling scream that was quickly cut short. Each of the apparitions seemed to grow bolder, stepping closer to the survivors with every passing minute. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting, preparing to swallow them whole. The survivors' nerves were on edge, their hearts racing as they heard a new sound, a faint scratching like fingernails on wood echoing through the trees. Suddenly, the ghostly figures moved in unison, gliding towards them, their eyes still glowing with that eerie, unnatural light. The men stumbled backward, panic surging through them, but the more they tried to flee, the more the apparitions surrounded them. The fog thickened, the air became suffocating, and the reality of their situation settled in. There was no escape. The swamp was alive with the restless spirits of those lost to its depths, and now they were the next to be claimed. The 3 survivors stood at the edge of the camp, their hearts still racing from the encounters with the ghostly figures. The fog thickened around them, a suffocating, oppressive wall that obscured their view. They turned their attention to the skiff they had used to escape the swamp, hoping that it could offer them some form of salvation. But as they watched, a chill ran down their spines. The skiff, abandoned on the edge of the water, began to move. At first it was slow, a slight rocking of the boat, as though a gentle breeze was pushing it. But there was no wind, no current, only the eerie, unnatural movement of the boat, gliding toward the water's edge. One of the men stepped forward, his breath shallow and quick, a feeling of dread overtaking him. "It can't be," he whispered, but his voice was barely audible over the growing hum of tension in the air. The skiff moved farther from the shore, seemingly without any external force. It drifted away, pulled by something unseen, as if it were being guided by invisible hands. The men watched, frozen in terror, as the boat was slowly pulled deeper into the water, closer to the dense fog where no one could see. The faintest sound of splashing reached their ears, but it wasn't from the skiff. It came from the depths, distant but unmistakable, a presence beneath the water. A low, guttural noise rose from the water now, like the sound of chains scraping across rocks. The men looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. It was as if something was trapped beneath the surface, struggling to break free. The sound of the chains grew louder, closer, until it seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Then came the breathing, deep, ragged, wet gasps, as though something massive was waiting just beneath the surface, its lungs filling with water. Every breath was like a death rattle, a constant reminder of the danger that lingered just out of sight. The men shuddered, the cold dread seeping into their skin. The skiff continued to drift, its movement growing more deliberate with each passing second. The eerie noise beneath the water intensified, as if the very swamp was holding its breath, preparing for something terrible to emerge. The survivors tried to move closer to the skiff, but their legs felt heavy, like they were wading through thick mud. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, as though the swamp itself was alive, feeding off their fear. Every step they took felt like it was leading them closer to their doom, yet the pull of the skiff was irresistible, dragging them toward it, drawing them into the darkened waters. One of the men tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the growing sounds of the swamp. Distant cries, the scraping of chains, and the low, reverberating sound of that terrible breathing. The skiff was now moving swiftly toward the mist, almost as though it were being pulled by a force beyond comprehension. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch out, their twisted branches reaching toward the boat, beckoning it into the water. Every instinct screamed at the survivors to run, to flee, but their legs refused to move. The swamp had them in its grip, and it was not letting go. The sound of the chains grew deafening now, louder and more urgent, as though something was finally breaking free from the depths. The skiff, once an escape vessel, had become a beacon, calling them back into the nightmare they had tried to flee. The water churned beneath the boat, bubbles rising to the surface like the breath of something enormous, something ancient. The men tried to call out, but their voices were drowned out by the unholy noise. The chains rattled violently now, and the ragged breathing grew louder, almost as though it were standing right behind them. Suddenly the skiff jerked violently, as though it had been yanked by unseen hands. The men staggered back, their hearts pounding in their chests as the boat was dragged further into the murky depths. The water around it began to froth, as if something massive was rising from below, its shape hidden in the depths. The fog seemed to part just enough for them to see the outlines of dark shapes swirling beneath the surface, massive shadows, moving in sync with the skiff, as though they were alive. The survivors realized with horror that the boat was not only being pulled by an invisible force, it was being dragged towards something far worse. The chains scraped once more, louder than before, and then, with a sickening screech, a massive shape broke the surface of the water. The men could see it now, a gargantuan form, its limbs twisted and unnatural, rising from the depths as if the swamp itself were giving birth to it. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly light, locked onto the men, and they could feel the weight of its gaze press down on them. The skiff was no longer an escape. It was a trap, a lure to draw them back into the dark heart of the swamp. The chains rattled once again, but this time they were not just beneath the water. They were reaching out, twisting and pulling as the thing below them finally revealed its true form. The men had nowhere to run. The survivors, now battered and broken by their ordeal, stood huddled in the center of the camp, their eyes darting nervously in all directions. The air around them was thick with fear, every breath feeling like it could be their last. The mist had thickened, swirling around them like a living thing, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, more sinister. The flickering light from their dying campfire cast eerie, distorted shapes on the ground, as if the very flames were mocking their attempts to stay alive. The low hum of the swamp had become louder, almost rhythmic, as if something was waiting, something ancient and malevolent ready to claim them. Suddenly, the shadows began to move. At first, it was just a shift, a flicker from the corner of their eyes. But then, the figures began to emerge from the mist, black shapes that seemed to drift towards them like smoke, gliding against the natural pull of gravity. The men's hearts raced as the figures grew clearer, their outlines becoming more defined, more solid. They were not human. No, these figures were twisted, their limbs too long, their faces shrouded in darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly, cold and empty, watching the survivors with a hunger that sent chills down their spines. The air grew colder still as the figures gathered around them, encircling the survivors in a silent, suffocating barrier. The flickering light from the fire cast grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently, growing and shrinking in unnatural ways. The survivors could hear whispers now, faint voices carried by the wind, but they couldn't understand them. The laughter returned too, distant but unmistakable, rising in volume as the figures drew closer. The survivors' breathing grew shallow, their panic escalating as the oppressive atmosphere closed in on them. They realized too late that they were no longer in control of their fate. The swamp was testing them, playing with them like prey. One of the survivors, his mind unraveling from the weight of terror, began to scream. His voice was high-pitched, frantic, filled with the raw, unfiltered panic of a man losing his grip on reality. The sound echoed through the camp, but the shadows around them seemed to absorb it, amplifying his terror. His eyes were wide with madness, his body trembling as he backed away from the approaching figures. "We're not meant to survive this," he shouted, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. His mind was gone, overtaken by the swamp's sinister influence. The others tried to calm him, but it was too late. Without warning, the man let out a final blood-curdling scream. His body went rigid, his arms flailing as though something invisible was pulling him. The shadows closed in around him, and with a sickening yank, he was dragged into the swamp. His scream echoed across the water, fading into the distance as his body vanished into the darkness. The remaining survivors could only watch in horror, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had failed. The swamp had claimed one of them, And now, there was no escape. The two men remaining turned to flee, but the shadows had already surrounded them, blocking their path. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread, a weight pressing down on them from all sides. The whispers grew louder, their voices becoming clearer, and the sound of chains dragging across the ground, mixed with the sinister laughter that seemed to come from all directions. The survivors stumbled backward, their minds reeling, their limbs weak with terror. They tried to run, but the swamp seemed to push them back, its invisible hands gripping at their ankles, pulling them closer to the dark heart of the forest. Flickering lights danced in the mist now, the flame from the dying fire casting strange, erratic shadows that seemed to taunt them. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and sway, as if the swamp itself were alive, a sentient being feeding on their fear. The shadows seemed to bend unnaturally, stretching and distorting, pulling the men in different directions. The survivors realized with growing horror that they were being tested, sacrificed perhaps, to release the trapped souls of the swamp, the very souls they had been running from all this time. Desperation set in as the survivors tried to escape the grip of the swamp, but it was too strong, too powerful. The shadows surged forward, their forms now taking shape, their faces indistinct but filled with malice. The final survivor screamed, his voice breaking under the weight of his terror. The swamp was alive, it was watching, and it was closing in. The ground shifted beneath him, his feet slipping into the wet, treacherous earth, and as the darkness enveloped him, he felt himself being dragged, his body sinking into the cold, wet depths. The last scream echoed into the night, swallowed by the swamp, and then silence. The lone survivor stumbled back into civilization, his body battered and broken, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt from the weeks of terror he had endured. He tried to explain, to recount the horrors of the swamp, but his words fell on deaf ears. People simply didn't believe him. They looked at him with pity, thinking he had been lost in the wilderness for too long, perhaps driven mad by the isolation. The once vivid images of shadowy figures and the growling of unseen creatures seemed to fade when spoken aloud, as if they were nothing but fragments of a fevered dream. No one saw the fear in his eyes, the genuine terror that still gripped his heart. When the authorities finally returned to the camp with him, it was nothing like the nightmarish place he had left behind. The camp had been rebuilt, the fire pit cleared, the bloodstains erased. The trees stood silently as if nothing had ever happened. The swamp lay still, its murky waters unmoving and calm, as if the terrible events he had witnessed had never occurred. No one could find any trace of what had happened to his friends or the malevolent force that had haunted them. The swamp, with all its hidden horrors, seemed to return to its eternal slumber, as though it had never been disturbed. It was as if the place had a power to erase its own history, leaving only silence in its wake. But the survivor knew better. He could feel it. Something was still there, lingering in the depths, watching him. The memories of the swamp, the ghostly whispers, the flickering lights, the terrible figures that had risen from the water, none of it had gone away. It was always there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. At night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the shadows again, those glowing eyes staring at him from the dark. He could hear the chains scraping across the floor, the ragged breathing of something just beneath the surface. His mind was unraveling, unable to escape the horrors he had witnessed. Everywhere he went, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was subtle at first, an uncomfortable glance from a stranger, a shiver running down his spine when he passed a dark alley or an abandoned building. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. It was as if the swamp had followed him back, its reach extending far beyond the place he had left behind. The same oppressive silence that had gripped him in the camp now surrounded him, and the whispers, those damn whispers, followed him everywhere. He could hear them, faint and distant, but always just out of reach. The swamp had marked him, and it was never going to let go. The survivor began to isolate himself, unable to trust the world around him. He stopped going to crowded places, avoiding the company of others. The presence he felt was overwhelming, like invisible eyes were watching his every move, judging him, waiting for him to slip. He couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp was closing in again, that the figures from the camp were still with him, waiting for the right moment to drag him back into the water. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding, the sound of chains dragging just beneath the surface of his thoughts. The memories of the swamp weren't fading, they were consuming him. He tried to find solace in the normalcy of life, going through the motions of daily existence, but it was all a facade. No matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled, the swamp haunted him. He could feel the dampness of the fog on his skin, the weight of the water pressing down on him. He would hear the laughter again, distant and mocking, but always so real. The shadows in the corner of his vision grew darker, their shapes more menacing, until they seemed to reach for him, pulling him back to the place he thought he had escaped. The struggle wasn't just with the memories, it was with the overwhelming sense that the swamp had marked him, and that it would never let him go. The survivor eventually returned to the swamp, drawn back by an obsession he couldn't explain. He stood at the edge of the water, staring into the murky depths. The fog hung in the air, thick and heavy, and he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. The echoes of the lost souls still haunted him, their whispers barely audible in the wind. He knew now that the real terror wasn't in the creatures of the swamp or the ghostly figures he had seen. It was in the memories that had taken root in his mind, a mental prison he couldn't escape. He was being tested, forced to confront the darkness that had followed him, and he could feel it waiting for him beneath the surface. The swamp had never let go of him, and it never would. He was its prisoner, trapped forever in the shadows of the glades.